So there was a cartoon once that I was told of, and it was playing on all the tropes that we're all familiar with and all of the classic Hollywood war films. And there was a council of war called, and all the tough and stern generals gathered together, and they were talking about the great crisis that they had to overcome. And one of the generals said, "So if anyone has any brilliant ideas, this is the time to share it." And one hand comes up, and he says, "And remember, gentlemen, failure is not an option." And the hand comes down. And the man mutters under his breath, "Oh, that's what I was going to suggest." And I love that. Because if we're honest to ourselves, how frequently do we have a little part of ourselves, that little mental denizen that says, "I have an idea, why don't we just fail?" Especially when we begin to recognize how tall the mountain is that we have been set to climb. What is the promise of the Scriptures? The Scriptures promise that ye too are gods, and that you will inevitably understand that. At the end of all great Scriptures, this is what they promise. At the end of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, he says, "And when thyself with shining foot shall pass among the stars scattered on the grass, and when in thy joyous errand you reach the spot where I made one, turn down an empty glass." And what he's saying at the end of that mystical series of poetry, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend you do, is after describing this multitudes of spiritual conquests and victories and great inner experiences that perhaps we've only dreamed of, he ends with that beautiful phrase, "And when thyself with shining foot shall pass." He's saying, and when you too come to that spot of final liberation, and you can finally get rid of your ego, then at last you will know what I have experienced. It's a promise. You too will be like me. But actually, at first, we think that that's quite encouraging, because we're not yet aware of what stands between us and that goal. We like to think to ourselves, yes, I too am a god, hear me roar. I was very charmed once when Swami Kriyananda said he overheard two women talking about what a psychic had told them they had been in past incarnations, and one of them said, "Well, a psychic told me that I had been Cleopatra." And the other woman said, "My darling, you must be mistaken, because the psychic told me that I had been Cleopatra." And so we all like to fantasize about the great things that we've been in the past. And we like to confirm that fantasy by thinking that we will again be great. But then one day we begin to recognize that the hill that we must ascend to become great is narrow and steep. As Swami writes in one of his songs, "The way to perfection is narrow and steep. The bypaths are many, the pitfalls are deep." And what's interesting is at first, when we begin to recognize that, there can creep into our hearts Satan's greatest ploy, despair. Satan wins when we despair. And isn't it interesting? I have an experience from my childhood that I think embodies a realization that every devotee must eventually face. And it's in this world, everything is a symbol. And therefore, in this world, nothing has any meaning. And on the other hand, it has all the meaning, if we can see it in the correct light. And as a young man, as a young boy, my parents took me to the mountains very frequently. My father and mother were both avid mountaineers, and we would frequent the high Sierras and spend many weeks there backpacking and, having rugged and rough adventures. And it was very formative to me in many ways. But as we grew older, every year we would be asked to carry more. And so at first, all I had to carry were my little Fisher-Price action figures. And that was challenging. And then there came a year when I had to carry a backpack with my water and my peanuts in it, and that was challenging. And then I had to carry my clothing. And then one year it was not only my clothing, but dare I say, my clothing and my sleeping bag. And eventually there came a time when I had to do more than just carry my own equipment. I had to start helping with the group. And so I was given, I remember very distinctly because it was such a harrowing experience, I was given my first bear cylinder. Now bear with me. This will pertain. And so that thing only weighs about 13 pounds, but if you're going from 18 pounds total to 31, that's a significant increase, right? And there I was probably about 11 years old, and not yet as stout of body and mind as I seem to be now today. And I remember my father put that backpack on me for the first time, and we began hiking. And I tell you, we hiked about 7.5 miles, several thousand feet of elevation gain, about over a 10,000-foot pass, which may not sound all that intense. But when you're 11 years old, that's really intense. And I remember when we got to the mountain pass, and my brothers, who were older and stronger than I, just carried themselves over to the top effortlessly, seemingly. And I slogged up that hill. And I remember my feet hurt, and my lungs burned, and my eyes were pounding, and I felt light of head, and the shoulder straps were digging into me. And I looked up, and the wicked thing about mountaineering, if ever you've been, is there's a phenomenon called a false summit. Okay, so some of you know what that is. And so you keep looking up, and you can see through the trees, you see the skyline, and you think, oh, that's the top. And you drag yourself to that position, and you realize that it was just a lie, and that there's more, and there's more, and there's more. I've since learned the trick is if you can still see trees, you're not close to the top. But I was slugging my way up this hill, and finally, at one false summit after the next, when I reached the next false summit, my willpower betrayed me, my courage left me, and I sat down and I began to cry. And all of my friends had abandoned me. I was alone. I hurt. I suffered. I couldn't see the top. But then the weird problem was, what options did I have? I couldn't go back. I had to go forward. But it was so desperately painful. And at that point, my father came to me, and I now respect his decision to do this, but at the time I was a little bit begrudging of it. And he looked at me and he said, Keshava, you have to get to the top. You can cry if you have to. You can scream if you have to. But the only way you're going to make it is if you keep walking. You can sit here as long as you want, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to move again. And my dad walked me up that mountain. Now, here's the interesting thing. At any point, my father was very strong. He could have taken that backpack, and he could have just hiked up the mountain and then given it back to me at the top, but he didn't. I'm very grateful that he didn't, because I cried my way up that mountain for the next hour and a half. And I stumbled to the summit, and there were clouds brewing overhead, and night was falling. I slowed everyone down so much that we didn't arrive to camp until like an hour and a half after dark. And as we began hiking the rest of the distance, I was like nearly drunk with exhaustion, and it began to rain. And that's like, could it get any worse? And finally, at that point, my father took pity on me and took my backpack, and I was able to limp the rest of the way home. But this is a very important moment for me, because I really had to face this reality that there is no other way. You have to get to the top. And that's what the call of the devotee is. That is actually also the promise of the scriptures. You too are gods. You have to get to the top. You can cry, you can scream, you can wail, but at some point you're just going to have to pick yourself up again and start walking. Now, what's very interesting is when we really face this as a devotee, this can unlock within us a great reservoir of energy. Because at first, we resist that idea. We'd like to think that, well, I've put out a little bit of effort, and look, after all, I'm so pathetic, maybe God will just come rescue me. And then we cry out and we say that there is no God because he didn't come rescue us. No, you just didn't put out enough effort to magnetize his grace to you in the first place. And so eventually, maybe with a little bit of the courage of a martyr, with the romantic sense that we march to our own doom, but at least we'll march bravely, the devotee begins to take one step forward again against our great obstacle of purifying all of our inner inadequacies, all of our delusions, and all of our faults. But then what may also come eventually is a very important turn in the devotee's mind. And to explain this, I'm going to pause myself for a moment and expand, which is that in the Mahabharata, and for time immemorial, the yogis have explained that our consciousness is like a great kingdom, that you are not merely one individual, but that you are like a kingdom composed of millions of people, all of your various tendencies and traits and qualities and habits and memories, all of them contribute and clamor for the attention of the king, your soul, to attend to them and their needs. And here's what's interesting. As Abraham Lincoln said, "A house divided shall surely fall." That in our lives, one of the things that keeps us from making true and profound progress towards that ultimate goal is the fact that we're actually still divided on whether or not we have to do it. Isn't that true if you really think about it? Don't you wake up some mornings and wish that you didn't have to meditate to feel the bliss? And that maybe today I'll just go get the espresso and that'll be the bliss and God will let me off the hook for today. And what's interesting is because of that, we have an interplay in our subconscious mind whereby we actually constantly resist ourselves. And this is the battlefield of Kurukshetra. We fight ourselves against the ultimate goal of reaching God alone. But eventually, there comes an opportunity when you can gather your subconscious denizens together and really have a frank conversation about life. And just ask them to introspect and say, given our experience, have we ever been rescued by the laws from the laws of the universe? Have you ever been able to experience some happiness without an effort concomitant to accomplishing it? Have you ever been given something without earning it? And so on and so forth. And if you're self-honest, eventually the subconscious mind will capitulate and recognize, yes, I suppose you're right, no one has ever rescued me. And therefore, I have to rescue myself. And when the subconscious mind begins to recognize that, it may begin to cooperate with Brother Soul, as St. Francis would put it, in the singular recognition that we have one goal left in life, which is to get home. But then what's very interesting is still, once we recognize that, and even though our subconscious mind may be willing and committed and no longer weeping at the necessity of conquering our own inner weaknesses, many of us are still plagued by fear. Isn't that so? It's very interesting. Fear is one of our most constant companions. That we're so afraid of what will come in the future. We're afraid of the tests that will come, and most of all, we're afraid that we will somehow be inadequate to meet them, right? And one of Yogananda's pithy statements that offers for us a goldmine of wisdom, if we have the courage to consider it and even more to live it, is that he said, there are no such thing as obstacles, there are only opportunities. Now, how can that be possible? Wouldn't it be so much more convenient if a helicopter would just carry us to the top of the mountain? But what's very interesting is when we begin to recognize that we must accomplish this goal, then we begin to recognize that the obstacles that come before us are necessary for testing and improving our own strength and our knowing of divine power and energy within us, yes. But that if we do truly accept that there's no other way, what we can become is like a good general of our inner nature. And here's what I mean by that. If you think about it, many of us, when a subconscious tendency or a karma or a fear arises, many of us respond thusly, oh no, because it seems to promise that there'll only be one more obstacle that we have to overcome before we can accomplish bliss or happiness or peace or whatever it is that inspires and moves your heart. But what's very interesting is, as Swami Kriyananda said, whenever you recognize within yourself a fault or a shortcoming, you ought to celebrate. And again, that's something that I've pondered for years, and I've tried to emulate that myself, but have never really been able to be successful. Because if I'm honest, I find and recognize some shortcoming in myself, and I go, oh God, no. Oh God, yes, yay. And I keep affirming that I'm happy about it, but if I'm honest, I'm not really very happy about it. I would much rather have just been perfect and not had to confront that after all. But the fact remains that if it was there to be found, it was always there. And eventually I'd have to face it, so why not now? Why not now? And this interesting thing is, I began to understand these two statements a little bit more clearly this week. This idea that there are no such thing as obstacles, only opportunities, and Swami's statement that if you find within yourself a shortcoming, you want to celebrate. And it came to me this week in an unexpected revelation, because I sat down myself to begin my sadhana one morning, and I felt particularly dejected. That's just the way my heart felt that morning. And I could in my mind's eye, I could feel set before me so many obstacles and troubles that I would have to overcome, both inwardly and outwardly, over the next year. And I thought to myself, Divine Mother, must I endure all of this? Like, in a sense, I was complaining. I said, haven't I gone far enough? Why are you going to ask me to do this? But what's interesting is I began to realize, first, I was weeping about it. I wished it were different. Then I began to accept, well, there's nothing for it, Keshava. You're going to have to face it one way or the other, so just might as well start putting one foot in front of it, one foot in front of the other until you get to the top. But then I realized something further. I thought, well, Keshava, if you're going to have to face these things, would you like to do it willingly or begrudgingly? And I went inside and I asked my subconscious denizens. I said, all right, lads, now listen. We're going to have to do this one way or the other. And I'm honestly asking, I'm not telling, but how do you want to do it? Do you want to do it grumpy or do you want to do it happy? And actually, a most miraculous thing happened. I really felt this rising roar of enthusiasm within myself. I felt all the little denizens of my subconscious mind beginning to cry back to me, we're ready. We're ready. Lead on. And it was very interesting. I learned two things that day. I recognized that, like a good general when taking to the field, Alexander the Great, who for all of his faults as a man, cannot be ridiculed as a general. And what's very interesting is when he awoke on the morning of one of his most famous battles, outnumbered as he was, 10-1, in an enemy territory, far without aid or assistance, in a field which favored the enemy's army, he woke up and one of his generals asked, "Sir, are you afraid?" And he said, "Afraid? What have I to be afraid of? God has delivered into my hands everything that I could ask. The enemy has finally stood to face me, and today we shall conquer or we shall die." And he went on to conquer. And I recognized actually that we should be like those wise generals. That actually, if you should recognize that when Divine Mother brings all of your karma to a fore and it seems like you couldn't possibly win, that's the decisive moment of your life. That's the moment that if you can rally all of your subconscious denizens like an army to willing cooperation, you could perhaps in a moment, in a single test, in a single hour, in a year, overcome such a great test that it would change the epoch of your life, that you could win such a great victory that generations of your own subconscious mind would benefit from it. And now I ask you, doesn't that thrill your soul to think of? Rather than thinking that these obstacles you face are just one more thing that you have to do before you can watch Netflix on a Saturday night, what if instead you think of them as one more opportunity to reclaim the kingdom of your consciousness and to build a new and better future, not only for yourself, but for all those whose lives you touch? But now how can we get ourselves to the place where our minds will actually willingly cooperate with that? Because it's one thing to say that, and it's a very different one to live that. And what's very interesting is Swami Kriyananda gave us a few suggestions herein, and so did Yogananda. Because they were no fools. They knew that the task we were set up against, that is to say, the promise of the scriptures, the rising and the finding of the perfection of our soul, is no mean task. It is quite challenging. And Yogananda said, if ever you come into contact with a test or an obstacle or a trial that you know will defeat you, run away. And again, one would think to yourself, what strange advice, given all the other things that we hear. There are no obstacles, there are opportunities. The greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. You too are gods. You can accomplish anything you set your will to do. And if you know you're going to lose, run. Now, why does he say that? Because until, as Omar Khayyam said, we too reach that spot where we made one and we too have the will of the infinite, we have to recognize our own limitations. And we have to recognize that there are parts of our own subconsciousness that are quite cowardly and that are quite afraid. And what's very interesting is, wherefore, we should lead ourselves wisely and we should lead ourselves well. And that if you choose and pick your spiritual battles and try to walk yourself through victories rather than through defeats, Yogananda said to develop your willpower that you should set your mind to accomplish something that you know you can finish. And he said, and do not cease until you have accomplished victory. And then choose something slightly harder and something slightly larger, something slightly bigger and more projected into the future until you can develop a mighty will. But what's very interesting is through this, you can train your subconscious mind to the habit of success, to this idea that of course we can conquer, because look, this is what we've always done. I'm very stirred by, as you can tell, history and some of the studies of the lives of great men and leaders. But there was once a great general by the name of Arthur Wesley, and he was constantly against a much more numerous and well-supplied foe. And for a long time, he had to fight a very defensive tactic of always retreating and running. But he was very smart. And what's interesting is from years 28 until his retirement at his late 50s, he never once lost an engagement. He never was defeated. And what was very interesting was he was extremely defensive and cautious until he knew he could win, even if he was outnumbered horrendously. And that's when he would dedicate his energy and his will and his resources and the lives of his subordinates on the line. And what was very moving is over time, his men began to believe that they could succeed. And I think that's where his genius lay. Because the general himself always had all the knowledge and the tactics and the understanding necessary for victory, but he needed the willing support of his army. And so too for us. You might know that you should practice Kriya every day. You might know you should practice affirmations. You might know that your delusions are false and that self-dialogue that tells you that you are worthless and that you will never be loved and that you have never succeeded in anything. You might know that that's all wrong, but your subconscious mind doesn't believe you yet. And so like a wise general, we need to guide ourselves into victories. First, small ones, and then larger and larger and larger, until eventually that body of our own subconscious mind will have so much confidence in Brother Soul as its leader that when you recognize that there's no other way for it, lads, there's no way but up, they will roar their approval and they will support you in every undertaking. And this is a really pivotal point, I think, in all of our lives that I encourage us to seek. And I want you to ask yourselves this week. How much of my own subconscious mind is spent resisting my own life? And I want you to imagine, what would life feel like if you were 51% willing at all times? If you were 51% cooperative with the inspiration of your soul? And what would it feel like if you were 100% cooperative? If every part of your being just rallied forth to every spiritual undertaking? Well, then truly there would be no obstacles. There would only be opportunities for great victories, for inner joy, for growing and expanding love, and for the deepening realization that you too are a child of God. And then you would be afraid of nothing. As it says in that beautiful chant, you won't have to fear anything anymore. You won't have to fear anything anymore. It's a tall mountain, my friends. But one thing that I find so magnificent about this path is that every step we take towards the oasis of God consciousness becomes more and more beautiful. And let's take solace in that. Let's remember that. And let's try to win every aspect of our subconscious mind to the task at hand. We are all prodigal sons and daughters. And we forget the fact in that parable that he had a long journey home. We don't talk about the fact that he probably had a whole odyssey before he got back to his father. And so too will we. So this week, my friends, let's ask for the power and the grace of the Masters to inspire us to face our obstacles, as Yogananda said, with the courage of a hero and the smile of a conqueror. God bless you all.
Let's have a few moments of silence. And we'll have some music.